war so significant in American history. So, I'm going to pick on some people here. You have one consequence of the French and Indian War? Nope. Richard? Okay. Huge debt for England. Big, major consequence. Yeah.
Unified.
Did help to unify the colonies a bit. Still not, like America, but they're starting to come together a little bit. Jenny, anything else to add to that? Well, they did do that. What did that lead to? The fact that they were trading with the French.
Oh,
yeah.
Come on.
It actually hurt relationship with Britain because of some of the stuff that they did.
I think another thing that drove a wedge between them was the ideals. You see the ideals of Britain versus the ideals of the States, and they weren't what they both of each other.
I agree with that. I'm going to just leave it alone, but yeah, it definitely. This war brought out some real differences between the way the Americans and the way the British saw things. Even though the Americans are considered part of the British Empire, it really did bring out their differences more so than their similarities. Tyler?
Come on.
Don't say that like a question.
Well, I just think that's what I read.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. I mean, it's huge, the difference in terms of what Britain gains through the French and Indian War, right? Yeah, everything east of the Mississippi becomes part of their territory. I love this map. This is 1754. This is the way things looked before, or as the French and Indian War was getting started. So you basically have, you see Russia. Russia's got territory up around Alaska. That's kind of important. But you've got the French in purple, the English in green, and the Spanish in orange, or whatever that color is. So this is the way the empire, or the empires looked in 1754. So you see France, right? France? No France. France? No France. They're just not there. They're completely kicked out of the mainland except for so they're pretty much kicked out of everything except the islands. So they had to give up all of their mainland territory, not just to England, but to Spain. Spain has everything west of the Mississippi, and England has everything east. So England gains a lot more territory, and is happy about that to a point. But what's another consequence of the the war. Anybody have anything else? Because of what you're doing, or just throwing up?
Didn't really take part in the war, still didn't take part in the war.
Yeah. The Indians definitely get the shaft. They're really the losers, because whether it's the French or the English, they end up on, bad terms with everybody. So, and they obviously lose more territory because the English are going to move into that territory, and the English were not as accommodating to the Indians as the French. The English are not. Remember, the French had kind of intermarried with the Indians. They traded, they had a better relationship with them. The English had always tried to kind of stay away from them. But staying away from them didn't mean you stay there and we stay here. What do you mean? We move into your territory and you get out. That's basically the way the English did things. So the Indians, right at the end of the war, the Indians try to strike back. And I don't know if your book went into this. Can you talk about Pontiac's uprising? Some of the Indians in the Ohio River Valley over here decided to join together and to try to fight against the British before they had a chance to really get themselves established. And they attacked a lot of the forts in the Ohio River Valley. Forts that had been French forts, but now the British were moving into. So in this transition period, they tried to attack and to gain back some of that territory, to be able to get a hold of it. Well, the British were able to put down, Pontiac was the leader of this uprising, so it's called Pontiac's uprising. The British were able to put that uprising down, but it made them more fearful of the Indians and more concerned about what it was going to take to keep the Indians under control. Because they're in debt majorly already, and now they're going to have to keep troops out there on the frontier to protect the colonists. And if they have these kinds of issues with the Indians, then it's going to obviously take more troops and more ammunition, guns, and everything else. So Britain is attempting to control that, and what was their response? How were they going to control that?
Yep.
What? The proclamation line. So that's what you see on that map there, is the proclamation line. I'm moving into question number 2 while I'm doing this, but we'll go back to 1 here in a second. So what's that line represent? Sort of. What?
They didn't want trading, so they didn't want the Americans to go that way.
Right.
Just to trade, because they would make more fighting.
Well, not just to trade, but they don't want them to settle over that line.
Yeah.
They're basically telling the American colonists, you can't cross this line. Now, was there a real line? They just draw the line across the top of the Appalachian Mountains. I know that sounds funny, but I actually had a student in West Texas that thought that there was a real iron curtain that was placed across Europe after World War II. They wanted to go to Europe and see the Iron Curtain. There was never an Iron Curtain. Now, what were they confusing it with? The Berlin Wall, which there was a Berlin Wall, but there was never an Iron Curtain that was placed across the continent. Okay, with a figure speech. Anyway, so there's not obviously a line that's drawn, but they basically said, okay, we're going to say that there's this imaginary line that you should not cross over, because if you do, it's probably going to lead to conflict with the Indians. And we can't afford that right now. We can't afford more wars with the Indians when we're trying to get ourselves out of debt. So the economists
my Wi-Fi
said,
off.
sure, we understand, we'll do whatever you say.
I don't know if that was it
Yeah,
for sure, but I
wanted
just,
to know.
What?
thanks, appreciate it.
Yes. They said that, but they went over there anyway, right? Yeah, they were like, sure he is. We worked hard for this. We just won this war against the French. We should have every right to move into that territory. This is another thing that is kind of a result of the French and Indian War, because somebody said it unifies them, but it also creates kind of a spirit of nationalism, a sense of pride in what they've accomplished, that they've been able to drive the French out of their territory.
Well, they were fighting by themselves at the beginning.
Well, they were in the beginning, you're right.
Yeah,
But to be honest, after about 1756, most of the fighting was being done by the British regulars, and the Americans
You know, I feel like that was when we blame them
Buying
for
riches of some sort, right?
Yes, I do actually.
Columbus and many other of the explorers at that time thought that by sailing, they could find a quicker route to get to the
Most
Indies.
of the American
What's in the
regiments
Indies?
and militia were pretty disorganized. They didn't really have any
Spices.
kind of, I mean, you know, from being in the
Anything else?
military, that there has
That's
to
all
be
I got.
something in charge.
There's gold.
And to them, a people
There's silk. Silk was a really important product of that time period. So there's a lot of stuff that they have in Asia that they don't have in Europe. So it's not just about finding gold to get, automatically rich, but it's being able to find these products that you can bring back to Europe and sell and make a profit off of it. And if you can continue to do that, you can make some really good money. So his idea is to find a quicker route to be able to get to Asia to bring all of this stuff back. Now, here's where the problem comes in for them, though, because even though they knew the world was round, and even though they had been to Asia, they thought the world was much smaller than it really is. So he was correct in that he could sail east to get west, or west to, west to get east. I knew that didn't sound very weird. So he could sail west to get east. I mean, that makes sense if the world is circular, right? But the amount of distance is much greater than expected.
Especially when you're telling the enemy. I mean, that doesn't, it's not gonna make the British soldiers feel very good. You're undermining what we're doing by giving them supplies and helping them. Oh, so you get to the end of the war, and, Britain had won, so in a sense, the Americans had won. And this, I always think of my son when
So the first part talks about New France, and just gives you a little bit of background in the fact that France had begun to
you always have those kids who
explore
sit at the bench all the
North
time,
America,
because their
starting,
team's not good enough to play. But when the game's over with,
well,
a lot of
the
times
first
they're
actual
being
settlement that
trash
they set up was Quebec in
they're the ones
1600.
walking around
Quebec
bragging
and
about
Montreal are
how
the two
they
first
trash this other team and
two
stuff, and
kind of
they
major
were,
settlements that they
they
set
didn't
up.
have field.
But even before that, they were exploring
He played most sports in high school, but he was horrible.
the New World and mostly got
And
involved
when
in
he
the
did
fur
play, he
trade.
was freed up.
So what part of
But then he was
the
the
New
biggest
World are they
crackpot
in,
when the game was over.
generally speaking?
I mean, he was the biggest bragger in the world.
So
So that's what the Americans
what
are like.
the French figured out is that for them, in order to be successful, they needed to have a decent relationship with the natives without the natives helping them
And therefore, we have the right, or we should have the right to move into the new territories we just conquered. So they want to move into that.
They were not going to be successful because they come here with thousands and thousands of people and they didn't know the land like the
Well, it
Indians.
depends on what you mean by weaker. I think financially, because they were struggling so much, there was a weakness there. Militarily and territorially, they grew and were seen by the rest of the world as being, because remember, mercantilism, the idea is the more that you have means the less that I have. So Britain comes out of this being perceived as the greatest world empire at the time.
All right,
However,
so
there's internal weaknesses that they have to address, and one of those things is their financial situation.
so they're not being enforced, it's almost as if they don't exist. So the colonists are able to get away with pretty much everything they do. This is
Our
occurred
country
in
that
a lot of Texas statutes.
a little bit,
Statutes are being done.
quite a bit, right?
But
I mean, do we, I mean, I know none of us are happy about that, but do we or anybody else in the world think?
start
that this
talking
is
about
that
becoming
They're
independent,
on the brink of collapse?
all right? They modeled their lives after the British. They wanted to look like them. They wanted to dress like them. They wanted to talk like them. They wanted their furniture to be from Great Britain. They wanted their tea sets to be
In this time
British.
period, they did.
They wanted to just
They really
remake
believed
Great
the
Britain
country had
and
to
America,
operate with a balanced budget.
at least in the
If
very
they didn't,
beginning,
they
at least for
felt
the
that
first
country
100 years
was
or
on
so,
the brink of collapse.
all right?
The
So
part of
keep
what
that in
Great
mind.
Britain is going through here is this
We
idea
already talked about
that,
the labor
oh,
force
we're so
to
much
begin
in
with
debt,
was mainly
then
indentured
that's going to mean
servants,
that we're not going to be able to continue.
at
as a
least
great
through the
world power.
1600s.
Now, we've
But
changed
then
our
as you
thinking
start
on
to get
that,
into
but
the
that was the
1700s,
way
or
we
even to the
perceived
mid
back in the time.
1700s and after, that's when we start
And we
making
did
more
really
use of
all the way up
African
until
slaves.
in this country.
I'm not gonna go through all of this stuff, but there's a lot of characteristics of the different areas of the colonies. Now, generally speaking, at this point in the history, we look at three different areas. We talk about New England, the middle colonies, and the South. So you take your 13 colonies and divide them into three different regions: New England, middle, and South. And they're very different
Out of
in
that
region
and
as
come
far
back
as their
into the
characteristics.
surplus by 1960. So within 15 years after World War II, we had paid off our debt and we're back into the surplus. But up until that point, one of the reasons why, who was president before FDR? Hoover. What did Hoover do to help people who became unemployed during the Depression? What? For the most part, nothing. He did a little bit. He actually did more than people give him credit for. But compared to FDR, he did very little. So he was just a horrible, terrible person, right? That's what everybody thinks of him. They just think he was the worst president in the world. So why did he not do anything? He definitely thought that the economy would take care of itself. That, you know, you just give it some time and it'll bounce back on its own. What other reason? What was I just saying? What? They would have been in debt. They had a balanced budget. He was afraid that if he starts doing handouts or starts creating, government public works projects and stuff like that, the country will go into debt. And you can't do that. That would be the worst thing in the world. At least that was what he thought, and that's what most economists in that time period thought, that you can't go into debt. That would just add more problems to the problems the country already has. Yeah, it's not necessarily the end of the world. Now, so if you aren't going to help these people that are literally starving to death on our streets, how are they supposed to get help? What was Hoover's response to them? No? Yes, it was not this cold-hearted making out. Which would be back in that time period. Where did you find that help? What? The church was supposed to be one of the key places that where you go to the church and the church tries to find ways to help you. The church, other community groups, and things like the Salvation Army. I mean, that's the type of organization that's where the assistance for people needs to come from charity, not from the government.
So, in some sense, you
So
could
in a
say
sense, it
this.
comes from us. We help each other. We don't look to the government to fix our problems for us. And it's really only been since FDR that we've done it. So when things aren't going well, we expect the government to fix it. We don't look to each other to try to find
Yeah, I
solutions.
think in general, you can just refer to the fact that inflationary aspect makes sense.
So, don't get me wrong, I actually think FDR was on the right track, but you're right, that, like,
I mean, I'm not
took the
saying it
war.
was a bad president. I mean, he was a good president. Everybody was not bad president. To get out of the debt, we have to come together as a nation. FDR did all the government things that they didn't do anything until we supported the war. You know, like when we supported the war, we put all our effort into it and helped at that time.
Because if you look at Hoover's record before he became president, he had some really a great
In terms
policy.
of, again, depending on the perspective we're looking at this from, if we're looking at this as being from a British perspective, by the time
Kind of
the
like,
French and Indian
I
War
feel
was
like
over
George
with,
W. Bush,
this was a huge,
not my favorite
we knew already
president.
that this
I
was
feel like he gets a bad rap because his
that was kind of
presidency
the piece
was
I
defined by
saw was
9/11.
missing up there, because
He didn't really get a chance.
again, when I say what are the consequences, what could be one of your first questions in terms of clarifying that question? For veterans, right? Who are we talking about? And it's not just
I don't know. I
British
just
and
don't think
colonists,
more
who else is involved
what
with
he
this?
could have done as president.
The French, the Indian. So when you ask that question, you can really answer it from many different perspectives. But
Going back to question number one, the consequences of the French and Indian War. Why is this particular war so significant for American history? When you had other,
There's also another piece of all
stuff,
the
but
other
why is
European
this
countries
war,
that
why
the
might this
war
war be
here,
so
the French and
significant?
Indian War, is part of a bigger war going on in Europe, which is referred to as the 7 Years' War. So, there's a whole lot of other stuff going on in Europe that ties to this, and we tend to get so isolated in our thinking here as Americans. We don't think about how it affects us, so we don't think about any of the consequences that are going on in other
Yeah,
places.
all of what you guys just said, all kinds of leads to the same thing, because this war brought out the differences, I think somebody said before, the differences between the two. It
Shows
shows
you kind of,
the
just using color,
fact that
basically.
they're kind of moving in different
What things
directions,
look like
and then
just
as
as the war was
Britain
breaking
begins to try
out
to
in
attack, to gain
1754,
some of the money back,
tell
the Americans reacted strongly to that.
colors here, but basically the British only had the area in green.
Appropriate, going back to what we said before about virtual versus actual representation. So it brings out these differences in the way that these two countries, or these two different areas,
So
view
again, depending on the perspective you're
how
looking at,
government
we're
should
looking
be
at this as
done,
being
and
from
also
Britain's
the goal
perspective.
that
By
the
the
people
time
have
the
in
French and Indian
government.
War was over,
I find it
this was
interesting that the
huge.
Americans don't want to
They
be
were already
taxed without representation, but they also don't seem to really want
And that was kind of the piece I saw was missing up there.
to do their part. What? Well, it's funny because they say that it's the reason why they don't want to be taxed is because they don't have representation, but really what it
In
comes down
terms
to
of,
is
again, depending,
because if Britain had been smart and said, okay, go ahead, bring some representatives over here, we'll let you have the people as part of this. But if you had sent people over there from America to be represented, and let's say, this group over here are the American representatives, and you guys are all the rest of the representatives of Parliament, and I stand up and say, I think we should tax the American colonies, who's in favor?
so, in some
You
sense.
guys are all gonna say aye, they're gonna say nay, but they get outvoted, so you get the tax on them. And they can't say they don't have representation, right?
Their price of oil a little bit.
Now, I don't know that it was really all about representation. I think a lot of it was just about, we've gone all these years, and we haven't taxed this, we haven't really tried to control it very much. The rules that you do have in place, you haven't enforced. And boom, we get to 1763, and all of a sudden, you want to slap all these rules on us. You want to start putting all these regulations on us.
I think that's the biggest thing is the state started to look at Britain as more of an ally,
Important to the future of their
part of their actual government.
and make the country
Because
more
they were
closer
already
to
trying to form them to begin with, they run themselves for so long.
Right. They weren't really seeing Britain as their boss. It was more like,
what's going on for
but keep in mind too, well, let's say we
In,
can last
in
question.
terms of, again, depending on the perspective you're looking at this from, if we're looking at this as being.
So, do you think they had the right to tax
By
the
the
American
time
colonies?
the French and Indian
At
War
the
was over,
beginning, I did what
this
I
was
said, I
huge.
think that
They
after
were already
they let Renfrew on
this is
themselves,
much
that
larger.
they had given up their
And that was
I don't know what it is, but I have, it's Mexico, you have arguments in other states.
Come on.
I think that they did have a right to back together as the and the question I had, do you think that they would have got it the right way? And I don't think that they did, because they had taxes that were in place on them prior to that time, and they weren't enforced. And the only way that you're gonna be able to pull something off like that is that you're consistent in everything. And because they weren't, you can't try to implement something on somebody if you haven't been implementing the same ideology prior to that. And they had every right to go about it, to try to recoup their losses of a large amount of debt. I mean, 7 years back then, it's a lot of money to do that. And for the colony.
In some ways,
They had
this
every
particular
right to go about
chapter
it. They have the right
is
to go about it. They had
more conducive for a story, if you had to explain to somebody what happened, it's carried in American history, well, this is the American Revolution, it's the story of the
example before, but parents, you got kids.
The battles.
Down the rules, but then you don't.
the kind of the backdrop to that, because there was stuff happening in America. So what my thought was, is that if you had to tell the story,
And then if all of a sudden
what
you try
happens
to,
in this chapter,
resurrect
do
something.
something.
Yeah.
What I would like you to do is take a couple minutes
Like,
out
oh,
of this
you
paper,
can't,
take a couple minutes
we've
to
been doing
write
it this way
down
for a long time, you can't just all of a sudden
What
change the
you-
rule in the stream.
what would be the major events that you would cover in the story. Like, if you wanted to be sure when you told somebody the story, that you wrote yourself some. What would be in your story? And then after you have the events written down, try to put them in chronological order. Not necessarily with exact dates, but just sort of give them the general order in which they happen. Because
Now,
it's another thing I find
on the other
students don't do real well. You just paper, jot some of this stuff down.
They had all the benefits of being English citizens. They had, the protection of the English military. They pretty much were not being taxed. If I ever said this? Because there were no direct taxes on the American colonists that went back. So you didn't get taxed with, on goods or property or anything where that money went back. The only taxes that they had imposed on them were on their trade. So those people involved in trade, there were taxes and regulations imposed on that would bring income to Great Britain. But as far as taxing an individual family, like sales tax or property tax, they didn't have any of that. Not that went to Britain. Now, Americans pay taxes, but they pay taxes to their own community. Their legislatures, their assemblies pass taxes to raise money for the church and other things that they need in the community. In England, as I said before, they were paying 25 times the amount of tax than Americans. So when this happens and they need to try to pay off their debt, they can't really look to the English people and say we're going to tax you more. Because they feel like they're already completely overburdened with tax. So they turn to the Americans, and first of all, I don't think the book says this, but first of all,
Alright,
they
for those of
actually
you
said to
who were
them,
not
look, we
here
really need your guys'
last
help.
week,
You need to start
on
contributing,
Thursday,
especially
we
if they should
spent
improve.
the
We're going to have to
time
keep on
talking
the
about
frontier
you.
to protect you. So how much are you willing to contribute, and how do you want to go about it? The Americans held up.
Sort of.
Back. Yeah, that's okay.
Actually, we did spend the time kind of talking about the class and how things are going and
They said, no, you
what's
must
good about it or not good about it.
That wasn't an option,
What
we were just saying,
might
you have to be
need
taxed,
changed.
but how do you want to do it? We're going to give you the
Interesting
opportunity to come up
I
with
think
your
for
own
me that
plan.
came out of it was that people were actually talked about the fact that we should be demanding more of
So Britain finally was like, well, sorry, if you're not willing to come up with a plan, we're going to have to find our own plan.
But
That was entirely Britain's fault.
one of the things that we did
I agree.
kind of,
But the Americans still have to take the
Actually, I'm not
step. If
sure
they really want independence, they have to take the step and
people
say,
stayed
no, we
even
don't want
after
to be part
class
of
and
your
talked a
country.
little bit more. And one of the things that
And
came
that's
out
what this is coming to, because they're going to, even if
maybe
Britain
2
did
days
it
a
in
week,
appropriate,
and then
they
the first
still
day
have
of
the
the
right
week,
to expect the
or
Americans to
Tuesday of the
contribute.
week,
Like a free ride.
probably
You're getting a handout. You're gonna take
lean more
advantage of
towards
it.
lectures
Right.
and being
And
a little
once it came to
structured.
this point, when things came to a head, and
Walking
Britain
through
said,
the
okay,
material,
we're tired
and
of you,
Thursday will be more,
freeloading off of us. The Americans had to make a decision, are they willing to
and
buckle
people said
under
that when I'm
and
asking questions
contribute,
and
or
asking
do they want to split and go their own way? And obviously that's what we're going to do now.
haven't actually covered the material yet, you sort of feel like you don't really have anything to say on the material. But we will talk about it first on Tuesday, and Thursday we should be able to have more. So we're going to try that and see if we have a little more structure on
Well,
Tuesday.
I'm not
kind of
really comfortable with
using like an outline and stuff like that, walk through
Right, and their
some
whole
of the
approach
points
to it.
of the chapter, then
I mean,
we'll turn.
they could have probably done this and continued to keep the American colonies if they had just approached it very differently. Because I think that what they did is they
These
hit them.
terms.
See,
And
it's one thing,
preparing
what are some of the things
this
that
list
they
of
did
terms,
that they hit
if you
them
were to do
right
this for
after
chapters
World War
5 and chapter 6, and then have this in front of you when you do your quiz.
Okay, that's like one of the very first things, right?
Because the quiz questions come
What
from
else?
those specific terms. Now, there's a lot of them.
But,
Um,
okay, that's a little later, but
on pre-war, we're actually going to, so not
Sugar Act,
come up with the Revolutionary War, but
Currency
talk more
Act.
about what led to it.
Stamp Act. And even before these things, they began to say, okay, all of those navigation laws that have been on the books for 100 years that we've never enforced, we're going to start enforcing. Okay, so when you get here, these two
But
were 1764.
I'm not going to necessarily go through every point that's on this outline because of time.
And there's other things too. There's one of the more important ones. I think your book calls it the Mutiny Act. So I used to refer to it as
And one of the things that
And there's other minor,
I have a
more
class
minor
for you
things,
guys.
but you've got all of these kind of major things that they began to pass on. So if you look at all of these different things in terms of the amount of money that it's going to cost the American colony, the way that I like to,
one of the things
example
that
that I like
noticed
to give,
more
and
and more
maybe
is
I've already done this in the
students
class,
don't take
but the whole idea of like you go to the convenience store to buy a Coke.
And one of the things that came out of our discussion last week was
So if you go buy a Coke, let's say
the
$1,
thing that
right?
come out of high school.
How much is it going to cost?
The way that you were taught to take notes in high school was
what?
basically the teacher put something on
That's
the
all we
board
did,
and
right?
said,
In my county, it's $1.07.
or had a PowerPoint.
Up here, it's $1.06, right?
Not PowerPoint, so I write all this stuff down.
Okay, so if you go in there and you, every morning you go in and buy your Coke and it's always $1.06, and you've got the exact change every morning. Here's $1, here's a nickel, revenue coming out of the money. Okay, so here's your $1.06, and you go in one morning, you know, say hi to the person and everything, and then, you know, they bring up your Coke and they say, oh, it's $1.07.
And if you do write it down, you don't
I
have
mean,
to
are you just gonna take the Coke and throw it in their face?
go back and look at them later, they're actually effective.
Can't do that to me, you can't charge me another penny, I've been paying $1.06 for years, I'm not gonna pay that.
Expect you to take notes now,
Is that what you're gonna do?
especially on Tuesdays. And I'm going to use an outline. So
Even if you have to grab the penny out of the other, no penny, right?
Write down, you know, the
Are you really, I mean, who's gonna throw a fit over paying one more penny for a Coke?
I'll tell you what, people get upset about paying 40
I know,
cents
some
for a
people
pack of
do, but
cigarettes.
the average person is not gonna do that, right? My point being, all of these things are pretty much like that. These are very minor taxes. It's not, you know, the book makes it sound like they hit it with this, and hit it with that, and all these huge taxes, and the Americans are just being overwhelmed with it. They're minor taxes. They were not going to raise that much revenue. It's not about the amount of the tax. It's about the principle of you don't have the right to tax us without our consent. And the fact that they don't pay taxes anyway. Now, if of all of these things, the one that I would have the most trouble with is this one. What did that do? All the paper money in colonies, the paper money that they use as a way to do business with each other. Why is that a problem? What? Because what do they have to be able to do business? Gold and silver, which is not plentiful in America. It basically shrinks the money supply. And that causes issues when you do that in the economy. That's why we have a Federal Reserve that keeps raising it and, you know, lowering it, changing it to try to keep the money supply where it should be to keep either inflation or deflation from occurring. Not that it, you know, you do it perfectly, but you try to do it as best as you can. This was really very much an issue for the American colonies because they were already starting to go into a depression. Why? Why would they begin to have a possible depression after the war was over with? Okay, so they don't have the French to sell to. That could have issues, but anytime you're in the middle of a war, you have to produce all these supplies, and you have to be able to purchase all these supplies and stuff because you've got the war going on. So the war actually caused kind of a boom in the economy, and the merchants in America had all of these different, whether it was the British or the French, all these different people to sell stuff to. The war's over with, all of that leaves, and the economy began to go into a downturn. So the Americans were already experiencing a downturn in their economy, and then you shut off all their currency and made money even more difficult to come by, and it created a pretty serious economic depression in this country. So that was probably, even though it was completely unintentional on the part of Great Britain, that was probably the worst of all of the things that they did in terms of the impact it had on their economy. Now, the other thing that they found very galling was the Quartering Act. What did that say you had to do? That you had to quarter the troops. Now, that didn't mean you had to give them your revenue. But you could put them in the barn, but you had to give them shelter and you had to feed them.
The large states and the small states tended to have.
Now, I don't know how many of you would, all of a sudden, wherever you live, if they
So,
said, oh, we can't afford to pay our
even
police,
though it may not be completely
to have their own house, so.
fitting into those categories, there is some truth to it if you just use large versus small. That's kind of my opinion. So, if you are a
I mean, even if you're not doing anything
large
wrong.
state, let me kind of start from the bottom and work my way up. If you are a large state,
So,
would your tendency
that
be
is
to
not
back
gonna go over well, even though
the
the
people that
Americans
ended up
vote
being called
good,
Federalists
imagine
or to back the people ending up being called Democratic Republicans?
now to say you have to do this. Nobody likes
The larger states tended to be more in favor of the Federalists. The smaller states tended to be more in favor of Democrat Republicans. All right, we'll talk more about that in a second. So, if that's the case,
So-
then who are the major politicians that fall under the category?
Again, don't get me wrong, you don't have to agree with me. I think Great Britain did have every right to tax the American colonies. I do also think that they probably could have handled it very
Washington,
differently. But you have every right to say, no, I don't think they had a right to tax them. And Americans are not allowed to do their own thing. Again, it's all about your opinion and your opinion backed up with evidence. That's why.
is a Federalist, but he's so much the voice of reason